To understand what Neanderthals hunted and what hunted them, we have to step back into the structure of the Ice Age world itself. Neanderthals did not live in a simple predator-prey landscape. They lived inside a dense, shifting food web shaped by climate oscillations, megafauna migrations, and intense competition among large carnivores. Food was not just sustenance, it was the organizing force of daily movement, tool design, social cooperation, and survival strategy. Neanderthals occupied much of western Eurasia during the Middle and Late Pleistocene, roughly from 400,000 to 40,000 years ago. This was a period defined by repeated glacial and interglacial cycles. Ice sheets advanced and retreated, forests gave way to steppe and tundra, and animal populations surged, collapsed, and redistributed themselves across the continent. Neanderthals were not passive occupants of this environment. They were highly specialized hunters adapted to cold climates, short growing seasons, and ecosystems dominated by large-bodied animals. From a metabolic standpoint, Neanderthals lived at the edge of energy balance. Their bodies were stocky and muscular, with broad chests, thick limbs, and high muscle mass. These traits reduced heat loss in cold environments, but came at a cost. Neanderthals required significantly more daily calories than anatomically modern humans living in temperate regions. Stable isotope analysis of Neanderthal bones consistently shows extremely high nitrogen values, placing them near the top of the terrestrial food chain. In simple terms, Neanderthals ate like apex predators. This dietary position immediately tells us something important. Plant foods alone could not sustain them, especially during glacial phases when edible vegetation was sparse or seasonal. Large game hunting was not optional, it was foundational. Neanderthals structured their lives around the predictable movement of herbivores across Ice Age landscapes. Rivers, valleys, mountain passes, and open plains acted as natural funnels where animals could be intercepted, ambushed, or driven into vulnerable positions. But Neanderthals were not alone in exploiting these resources. The same animals they hunted were also pursued by other formidable predators: cave lions, steppe wolves, scimitar cats, cave hyenas, and massive brown bears. In many regions, Neanderthals were not the dominant hunters, but competitors operating under constant pressure. Every carcass represented both food and risk. Kill sites attracted scavengers, and scavengers could become attackers in seconds. This is where Neanderthal hunting strategy begins to separate itself from later human methods. Archaeological evidence shows that Neanderthals relied heavily on close-range hunting using thrusting spears rather than long-distance projectile weapons. Wooden spears preserved at sites like Skaaningen indicate weapons designed for stabbing at close quarters, likely requiring coordinated group action. This approach was dangerous, but it was effective against large, slow-moving prey, and it produced high returns in calories, fat, and protein. Importantly, Neanderthals were not indiscriminate hunters. Their prey choices reflect deep ecological knowledge. They focused on animals that offered the greatest energy payoff relative to risk: large herbivores with predictable behavior, seasonal migration patterns, and vulnerable moments during calving, river crossings, or winter scarcity. This selectivity shaped their entire relationship with the animal world. At the same time, Neanderthals themselves were not immune from predation. While adult Neanderthals were formidable, injuries preserved in skeletal remains tell a clear story. Many Neanderthal bones show healed fractures consistent with close encounters with large animals, broken ribs, crushed limbs, facial trauma. Some injuries resemble those seen in modern rodeo riders, suggesting repeated high-risk confrontations. Others are harder to explain without considering attacks from large carnivores. So when we ask what Neanderthals hunted, we must also ask how they positioned themselves within a landscape where they were both hunters and potential prey. Their lives unfolded at ground level, face to face with animals that outweighed them, outran them, and could kill them in seconds. Survival depended not on domination of nature, but on negotiation with it, reading signs, timing movements, cooperating tightly, and knowing when to advance and when to retreat. In the segments ahead, we'll move deeper into this Ice Age ecosystem. We'll examine the specific animals Neanderthals relied on most heavily for food, how they hunted them, and how those prey choices shaped Neanderthal biology and culture. Then we'll turn the perspective around and look at the predators that stalked Neanderthals themselves, animals that did not see them as fellow hunters, but as just another large, vulnerable source of meat in a dangerous world. If segment 1 set the ecological stage, this is where the structure becomes visible. The Neanderthal diet was anchored by a relatively small number of large herbivores that dominated Ice Age Eurasia. These animals were not just food sources, they were the pillars around which Neanderthal movement, technology, and seasonal planning revolved. When these animals shifted their ranges or declined, Neanderthal survival strategies had to shift with them. Across much of their range, Neanderthals focused on large-bodied ungulates, hoofed mammals that traveled in herds, followed predictable routes, and carried enormous amounts of usable calories. Among the most important were steppe bison, wild horses, woolly rhinoceroses, and mammoths. In forested regions, red deer, reindeer, and giant deer often replaced the open steppe megafauna as primary targets. The exact species varied by region and climate phase, but the hunting logic remained consistent. Large herbivores offered three things Neanderthals needed most: fat, protein, and reliability. A single adult bison or horse could provide tens of thousands of calories, enough to support a small group for days or weeks if properly processed. Fat was especially critical. In cold environments, lean meat alone can lead to protein poisoning, a condition known from ethnographic studies of Arctic populations. The marrow, brain tissue, and subcutaneous fat of large animals were essential for maintaining energy balance. Neanderthals were keenly aware of this, as evidenced by systematic bone breakage patterns designed to extract marrow and grease. Horses were among the most consistently hunted animals in Neanderthal sites across Europe. They were abundant, traveled in groups, and occupied open landscapes where ambushes could be coordinated. Cut mark analysis on horse bones shows repeated, standardized butchery practices, indicating that Neanderthals were not improvising. They were following learned routines refined over generations. These routines included skinning, disarticulation, marrow extraction, and sometimes transport of high-value portions back to sheltered sites. Bison and aurochs presented higher risks, but even higher rewards. These animals were aggressive, fast, and capable of killing a human with a single charge. Hunting them likely required tightly coordinated group action, with individuals positioning themselves to distract or redirect the animal, while others delivered close-range thrusts. The frequent presence of healed traumatic injuries in Neanderthal skeletons suggests that such hunts were common and dangerous, not rare accidents. In colder, more northern environments, reindeer became a dominant prey species. Reindeer herds migrated seasonally along well-defined corridors, creating predictable hunting opportunities. Archaeological sites associated with reindeer hunting often show evidence of seasonal occupation, suggesting that Neanderthals timed their movements to coincide with these migrations. This kind of planning implies not only ecological knowledge, but also social memory, knowledge passed down and reinforced within groups. Mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses occupy a special place in the Neanderthal imagination, but the evidence suggests they were hunted less frequently than smaller megafauna. These animals were enormous, extremely dangerous, and difficult to process. When they do appear in archaeological contexts, it is often unclear whether they were actively hunted or opportunistically scavenged after natural deaths. Even so, the ability to exploit a mammoth carcass, harvesting meat, fat, sinew, and bone, would have been a significant advantage in harsh environments. What becomes clear from the archaeological record is that Neanderthals were not generalist foragers in the modern sense. They did not rely on a wide buffet of small animals and plant foods year-round. Instead, they focused intensely on a narrow set of high-yield prey species and structured their lives around them. This specialization made them extremely effective hunters, but it also made them vulnerable to environmental change. When climates shifted rapidly and animal populations fragmented or declined, Neanderthals had fewer fallback options. Their hunting choices also shaped their technology. Stone tools associated with Neanderthal sites are often heavy, robust, and designed for butchery as much as for killing. Scrapers for hide processing, large flakes for dismemberment, and points suited for thrusting all reflect a subsistence strategy centered on large game. Clothing made from thick hides, shelters reinforced with bones, and fuel derived from animal fat further tied Neanderthal survival to these herbivores. In short, large Ice Age herbivores were not just prey. They were the engine of Neanderthal existence. Every successful hunt reinforced a way of life that had worked for tens of thousands of years, but also locked Neanderthals into a narrow ecological niche. In the next segment, we'll move from the animals they relied on to the methods they used to kill them, examining how Neanderthals hunted at close range in a world where mistakes were often fatal. Neanderthal hunting was not built around distance, safety, or mechanical advantage. It was built around proximity. Archaeological, anatomical, and experimental evidence all point to a hunting strategy that required Neanderthals to operate within a few meters of animals that could kill them instantly. This was not a primitive limitation. It was a calculated adaptation to the environments they lived in and the prey they pursued. The primary hunting weapon of Neanderthals was the thrusting spear. Unlike later projectile spears or arrows, these weapons were designed to be driven into an animal's body at close range using the full strength and body mass of the hunter. The wooden spears recovered from Skåningen in Germany, dated to around 300,000 years ago, are long, carefully balanced, and hardened by fire. Their construction shows a clear understanding of aerodynamics and weight distribution, but their length and thickness indicate use as stabbing weapons rather than thrown projectiles. Close-range hunting placed extreme demands on coordination and timing. A single hunter could not safely bring down a large herbivore alone. Neanderthal hunts likely involved small groups working together to isolate individuals from a herd, drive animals into constrained terrain, or exploit moments of vulnerability, such as river crossings, deep snow, or calving seasons. Geography mattered. Narrow valleys, forest edges, and steep embankments turned raw strength into advantage by limiting an animal's ability to charge or escape. This style of hunting explains many features of Neanderthal anatomy. Their broad shoulders, thick arms, and powerful grip strength were well suited for absorbing impact and delivering forceful thrusts. Biomechanical studies suggest that Neanderthals could generate tremendous upper body power, comparable to modern elite athletes engaged in heavy manual labor. Their skeletal asymmetries, often stronger on one side, mirror patterns seen in modern spear users and throwers. The risks of this approach are written directly into Neanderthal bones. Healed fractures of ribs, forearms, clavicles, and skulls are unusually common. Many injuries resemble those sustained by modern rodeo riders who experience repeated collisions with large, unpredictable animals. This pattern strongly suggests frequent close encounters with large prey rather than occasional accidents or interpersonal violence. Hunting did not end with the kill. The moment an animal collapsed, the danger shifted rather than disappeared. Blood, sound, and movement attracted predators and scavengers quickly. Cave hyenas, wolves, and large cats could arrive within minutes. Neanderthals had to butcher rapidly, prioritize high-value parts, and remain alert. The presence of cut marks overlaid by carnivore tooth marks on some bones suggests repeated contests over carcasses. Toolkits reflect this urgency. Neanderthal stone industries include heavy scrapers for hide removal, sharp flakes for rapid disarticulation, and robust points that could double as weapons and tools. Efficiency mattered. The faster meat could be removed and transported, the lower the risk of violent confrontation with other predators. This hunting style also shaped Neanderthal social structure. Cooperation was not optional, it was a survival requirement. Individuals had to trust one another to hold positions, distract animals, and intervene when something went wrong. Injured individuals often survived long after trauma, indicating that groups supported wounded members rather than abandoning them. Hunting success depended not only on strength and skill, but on social cohesion and shared knowledge. Yet this close-range strategy had limits. It worked best in environments with large, predictable prey and terrain that could be exploited. As climates became more variable and prey populations more fragmented, the cost of close-quarters hunting increased. Other human groups would later develop long-range weapons that reduced personal risk and expanded prey options. Neanderthals, by contrast, remained committed to a strategy that had served them well for hundreds of thousands of years. In the next segment, we'll narrow the focus to specific prey species, examining which animals Neanderthals hunted most frequently, how prey choice varied by region, and what those choices reveal about Neanderthal adaptability and constraints within the Ice Age ecosystem. One of the most revealing aspects of Neanderthal hunting is not just what they hunted, but how narrowly they often focused on a single dominant prey species within a given region and time period. Archaeological sites across Europe and Western Asia repeatedly show the same pattern. Long-term occupation layers dominated by the bones of one primary animal, sometimes making up 70 to 90% of all identified remains. This was not ecological coincidence. It was strategic specialization. In parts of Western Europe, especially during colder phases, horse dominates Neanderthal assemblages. Entire landscapes were effectively structured around horse behavior, where herds grazed, where they moved seasonally, and where they could be intercepted. Sites such as open plains near river valleys show repeated kill and butcher episodes, sometimes spanning thousands of years. The consistency suggests that Neanderthals returned to the same locations generation after generation, exploiting learned patterns in animal movement. In forested regions, red deer often replaced horse as the primary prey. Deer behavior differs significantly: smaller group sizes, more cover-dependent movement, and heightened alertness. Hunting them required different tactics, more ambush, more patience, and likely smaller hunting parties. The archaeological record reflects this shift. Tools associated with deer-heavy sites tend to show greater emphasis on fine butchery and hide processing, consistent with animals that provided valuable skins as well as meat. Farther north and east, especially in colder, more open environments, reindeer become dominant. Reindeer migration routes acted like moving food corridors, and Neanderthals appear to have timed their movements to intersect these flows. Seasonal kill sites show spikes in reindeer remains that correspond to known migration periods. This implies planning across months, not days, and suggests that Neanderthal groups carried mental maps of animal behavior tied to specific landscapes. Bison-dominated sites are particularly striking. In some regions, bison bones overwhelm all other species in the archaeological record. Bison are large, aggressive, and dangerous prey, but they also offer enormous caloric payoff. Specializing in bison hunting likely required exceptionally tight group coordination and deep knowledge of herd dynamics. These sites often show repeated mass processing events, indicating that Neanderthals were capable of handling large quantities of meat and fat efficiently, possibly drying or caching portions for later use. What is equally important is what we don't see. Small animals, rabbits, birds, fish, are generally rare or absent in Neanderthal-dominated layers, especially when compared to later modern human sites. This absence is not because Neanderthals were incapable of catching them, but because such prey offered poor energy returns relative to effort. Neanderthals optimized for efficiency in a harsh environment where calories were life. This prey specialization had advantages. Focusing on one primary species allowed Neanderthals to refine hunting techniques, tool use, and butchery routines to a high degree. It reduced uncertainty and increased success rates in familiar terrain. But it also created vulnerability. When climates shifted rapidly and preferred prey declined or migrated away, Neanderthals could not always pivot quickly to alternative food sources. Regional specialization also limited population density. Large herbivores require vast territories, and Neanderthal groups needed wide ranges to support themselves. This kept populations sparse and isolated, reducing opportunities for cultural exchange and innovation. In contrast, later human groups exploiting broader diets could sustain higher densities and more interconnected social networks. By examining which animals dominate individual sites, we gain insight into how tightly Neanderthals were coupled to their environments. They were not wandering opportunists, they were deeply embedded specialists. In the next segment, we'll turn away from prey and look upward in the food chain, to the animals that competed with, harassed, and sometimes hunted Neanderthals themselves, revealing how dangerous their world truly was. Neanderthals occupied a high position in the Ice Age food web, but they did not stand uncontested at its peak. Eurasia during the Pleistocene supported an unusually dense population of large carnivores, many of them larger, stronger, and better equipped for killing than any modern predator. In this environment, Neanderthals were not just hunters competing for meat, they were also potential prey. The most dangerous of these predators was the cave lion. Larger than modern African lions and adapted to open, cold environments, cave lions hunted large herbivores using strength, speed, and coordination. While direct evidence of cave lions attacking Neanderthals is rare, as expected given preservation biases, the overlap in habitat and prey makes encounters inevitable. A solitary or injured Neanderthal would have been a viable target, especially near kill sites or during low-visibility conditions. Cave hyenas posed a different kind of threat. These animals were not just scavengers, but dominant predators capable of bringing down large prey. They lived in large clans, occupied caves and rock shelters, and competed directly with Neanderthals for both food and shelter. Many Neanderthal sites show alternating occupation layers, with human tools in one layer and hyena dens in another. This pattern suggests repeated displacement rather than peaceful coexistence. A Neanderthal returning late to a familiar shelter could easily have encountered a lethal ambush. Wolves, particularly large Pleistocene forms, also played a complex role. While wolves rarely hunt adult humans directly, packs could harass, shadow, and attack vulnerable individuals, especially children or injured adults. Wolves were persistent, intelligent, and opportunistic. In winter conditions, when food was scarce and movement was difficult, the boundary between competitor and predator could blur quickly. Perhaps the most underestimated threat came from bears, especially cave bears and large brown bears. Cave bears were primarily herbivorous, but could be extremely dangerous when surprised, wounded, or defending hibernation sites. Brown bears, by contrast, were omnivorous apex predators. Encounters in dense forests near carcasses or inside caves could be fatal. Some Neanderthal skeletal injuries, crushing trauma to the skull or torso, are consistent with bear attacks rather than hunting accidents. What makes these threats especially significant is the context in which they occurred. Neanderthals did not live behind walls or in permanent structures. Their shelters were temporary, their camps exposed, and their movements visible across open landscapes. Fire provided some deterrence, but it was not a guarantee of safety. Predators learned quickly. A carcass left unattended, a weakened individual, or a sleeping group could all attract attention. Children were particularly vulnerable. Although direct evidence is scarce, demographic modeling suggests that predation pressure on juveniles could have had meaningful effects on population stability. Even low levels of child mortality can destabilize small, slow-growing populations over long periods. Importantly, predation did not have to be frequent to matter. The constant risk of predation shaped behavior. Campsites were chosen for visibility and defensibility. Group cohesion was critical. Injured individuals were protected and cared for, not abandoned, because isolation dramatically increased mortality risk. Nighttime movement was likely minimized, and auditory awareness, listening for movement calls or disturbances, would have been a constant background task. Neanderthals survived in a world where they were never fully safe. They were strong, skilled, and intelligent, but they lived among animals that did not recognize them as dominant. In the next segment, we'll look at the indirect consequences of this pressure, how predation risk shaped Neanderthal behavior, social structure, and the way they used fire, shelter, and landscape to stay alive. Predation pressure does not need to result in frequent deaths to reshape a species' behavior. For Neanderthals, the constant presence of large carnivores created an environment where every decision, where to camp, when to move, how long to stay at a kill site, carried consequences. Over tens of thousands of years, this pressure left a measurable imprint on Neanderthal behavior and social organization. One of the clearest effects is seen in campsite selection. Neanderthal sites are rarely random. They tend to occupy elevated positions with good visibility, cave mouths with defensible entrances, or open areas near natural barriers such as cliffs, rivers, or steep slopes. These locations reduced surprise encounters and limited the angles from which predators could approach. Even in open-air sites, artifact distributions suggest that Neanderthals cluster activities tightly, maintaining group cohesion rather than dispersing widely across the landscape. Fire played a central role in mitigating risk. Hearths are a near-universal feature of Neanderthal sites, and their repeated construction in the same locations suggests careful fire management rather than opportunistic use. Fire provided warmth and cooking, but just as importantly, it created light, sound, and scent that discouraged predators. The psychological barrier of flame is effective against most large carnivores, especially at night. Maintaining fire was not merely a comfort, it was a defensive necessity. Shelter use reflects similar priorities. Caves and rock shelters offer protection, but they were also highly contested resources. Many show alternating occupation between Neanderthals and carnivores, indicating that control of these spaces shifted over time. This suggests that Neanderthals may have avoided long-term reliance on any single shelter, instead rotating between sites to reduce risk and competition. Temporary structures in open areas, while less secure, may have been used strategically when caves were unsafe or already occupied. Group size also appears to have been influenced by predation. Neanderthal groups were likely small, but not solitary. Living and traveling in groups reduced individual vulnerability and increased vigilance. Cooperative care for injured individuals, evident from severely healed fractures and degenerated conditions, suggests that group survival was prioritized over short-term efficiency. Abandoning injured members would have increased overall risk by fragmenting social units and reducing cooperative strength. Daily activity patterns were likely shaped by caution. Extended butchery at kill sites increased exposure, so Neanderthals often transported high-value portions back to safer locations. This behavior is well documented through skeletal part representation at sites, with heads and limb bones, rich in fat and marrow, preferentially moved. Speed and efficiency mattered more than total yield. Even tool design reflects defensive considerations. Robust tools doubled as weapons. A heavy scraper or point could be used to deter a predator at close range if necessary. There is no sharp boundary between hunting gear and defensive equipment in Neanderthal assemblages, reinforcing the idea that danger was constant rather than episodic. Importantly, this pressure may have influenced cognition and perception. Heightened situational awareness, sensitivity to sound and movement, and strong social bonding would all have been advantageous. In such an environment, survival favored individuals who were attentive, cooperative, and deeply familiar with their surroundings. Yet living under constant pressure comes at a cost. Stress, injury, and limited flexibility can reduce resilience to sudden environmental change. As conditions became more unstable toward the end of the Pleistocene, Neanderthals faced not only shifting climates and prey distributions, but also a world that demanded increasingly rapid adaptation. In the next segment, we'll explore how Neanderthals interacted with the remains of animals beyond food, how bones, hides, sinew, and fat were integrated into tools, shelter, and survival strategies, further deepening their dependence on the animal world. For Neanderthals, an animal did not stop being useful once it was killed. In a harsh and unpredictable environment, survival depended on extracting as much value as possible from every successful hunt. Meat was only the most obvious resource. Bones, hides, sinew, fat, and even teeth became integrated into nearly every aspect of Neanderthal life, blurring the line between subsistence and technology. Butchery marks on Neanderthal prey bones reveal a systematic, almost methodical approach to carcass processing. Animals were not simply cut apart for immediate consumption. Limbs were disarticulated in consistent sequences, joints were opened efficiently, and long bones were deliberately fractured to access marrow. In many sites, bones were later boiled or heated to extract bone grease, a calorie-rich substance critical during cold seasons when fat scarcity could be deadly. This level of processing indicates planning beyond the moment of hunger, with an eye toward maximizing long-term energy return. Hides were equally important. Large herbivore skins provided insulation, wind protection, and bedding. Scrapers found at Neanderthal sites show heavy were consistent with hide working, including defleshing and softening. In Ice Age climates, untreated hides stiffen and crack, so effective processing required time, skill, and repeated handling. Clothing made from thick hides would have been essential for survival in cold, wet environments, especially during winter hunts and long-distance travel. Sinew, tough fibrous tissue from tendons, was another critical resource. It could be twisted into cordage used for binding spear points, repairing tools, and possibly constructing simple shelters. Sinew is remarkably strong and flexible, outperforming many plant fibers in cold conditions. Its use reflects a deep understanding of animal anatomy and material properties, even in the absence of formal engineering concepts. Bone itself became a structural and functional material. While Neanderthals relied primarily on stone for cutting tools, bone fragments were used as retouchers to shape stone edges, leaving distinctive wear patterns that appear repeatedly across sites. In some environments, large bones may also have been used as structural elements, supports for windbreaks or frameworks for hide-covered shelters, especially in treeless steppe regions where wood was scarce. Animal fat played roles beyond nutrition. Fat burns cleanly and can supplement scarce wood as fuel. Some archaeological evidence suggests that Neanderthals deliberately collected and rendered fat, possibly storing it for later use. In environments where plant-based fuels were limited, animal-derived fuel would have extended the usefulness of fire, reinforcing its central role in warmth, cooking, and defense. Even teeth and antler had potential uses, whether as tools, ornaments, or symbolic objects. While Neanderthals did not produce symbolic artifacts in the same volume or style as later modern humans, there is growing evidence that they occasionally collected and modified animal parts in ways that went beyond strict utility. These behaviors hint at cognitive flexibility and more complex relationship with animals than simple predator and prey. This total-use strategy was not optional. High hunting risk and low success rates meant that waste was costly. Every animal represented a rare convergence of opportunity, danger, and reward. Extracting maximum value reduced the number of hunts required and lowered exposure to injury and predation. At the same time, this deep dependence further tied Neanderthals to large animals. Their clothing, shelter, fuel, and tools were all anchored in the availability of megafauna. When those animals declined or disappeared, Neanderthals lost more than food. They lost the material foundation of their way of life. In the next segment, we'll examine how these pressures intersected with competition from other humans, and how differences in hunting strategies and prey flexibility may have tipped the balance in a changing Ice Age world. By the later stages of the Pleistocene, Neanderthals were no longer the only humans navigating the Ice Age food web. Anatomically, modern humans began expanding into regions long occupied by Neanderthals, and this introduced a new kind of pressure, one that did not hunt Neanderthals directly, but competed with them for the same animals, landscapes, and seasonal opportunities. At first glance, Neanderthals and modern humans hunted many of the same species. Horses, reindeer, bison, and deer appear in archaeological sites associated with both groups. But beneath this overlap lay important differences in strategy. Neanderthals remained highly focused on large-bodied prey and close-range hunting, while modern humans increasingly diversified their diets. They exploited smaller animals, birds, fish, and plant foods more intensively, especially during periods when large game was scarce. This difference mattered most during environmental instability. As climates fluctuated more rapidly toward the end of the last glacial cycle, large herbivore populations became less predictable. Herds fragmented, migration routes shifted, and local extinctions became more common. Neanderthal specialization, once a strength, became a liability. When preferred prey declined, Neanderthals had fewer reliable alternatives. Modern humans, by contrast, appear to have buffered themselves against these fluctuations by broadening their subsistence base. Long-range projectile weapons reduced hunting risk and expanded prey options. Nets, traps, and fishing technologies allowed access to resources Neanderthals rarely exploited. Even modest increases in dietary flexibility could support higher population densities and more stable food supplies. Competition also played out indirectly. If modern humans reduced prey availability through more efficient or frequent hunting, Neanderthals would have felt the effects even without direct conflict. Fewer animals meant longer travel distances, more dangerous hunts, and increased exposure to predators and injury. In small populations, these pressures compound quickly. There is little evidence for widespread violent conflict between Neanderthals and modern humans, but competition does not require combat to be decisive. Occupying the same ecological niche with a more flexible strategy is often enough to displace a specialist over time. The archaeological record shows Neanderthal populations thinning, fragmenting, and retreating into refugial areas as modern humans expanded. Importantly, this was not a sudden replacement. In some regions, Neanderthals and modern humans overlapped for thousands of years. During this time, Neanderthals continued to hunt effectively, care for their injured, and exploit familiar prey. But the margin for error narrowed. Each failed hunt, each injured hunter, each harsh winter carried greater consequences. Seen through the lens of hunting and predation, Neanderthal disappearance looks less like a dramatic collapse and more like a slow erosion. Their world became more crowded, more competitive, and less predictable. The animals they depended on grew harder to find, while the risks of pursuing them remained high. In the next segment, we'll return to the predators of the Ice Age and examine how shifting animal communities and the loss of megafauna reshaped the balance between hunters, competitors, and prey during the final chapters of Neanderthal history. By the final millennia of Neanderthal existence, the animal world they had adapted to for hundreds of thousands of years was beginning to change in fundamental ways. This was not a single collapse, but a gradual thinning of the ecological fabric that supported their way of life. Large herbivores became less abundant, less predictable, and more unevenly distributed across the landscape. For species so tightly bound to big game hunting, these shifts carried profound consequences. Climate variability intensified toward the end of the Pleistocene. Rapid swings between cold and warmer conditions disrupted plant communities, altered migration routes, and fragmented open steppe environments into patchier mosaics of forest, grassland, and scrub. Large-bodied herbivores, which require extensive grazing territory and stable seasonal cycles, were especially sensitive to these changes. Some populations declined locally, others shifted their ranges beyond areas Neanderthals had relied on for generations. This mattered because Neanderthal subsistence strategies assumed a certain reliability in the presence of large prey. Their hunting methods, toolkits, clothing, and shelter systems all presupposed access to animals that could provide not just meat, but fat, hides, sinew, and bone. As these animals became harder to find, the cost of each hunt increased sharply. Longer travel distances meant greater energy expenditure and higher exposure to injury and predation. Failed hunts were no longer rare setbacks, they became existential threats. At the same time, predator dynamics shifted. As herbivore numbers declined, competition among carnivores intensified. Predators that once focused primarily on large prey may have become more opportunistic, increasing pressure on smaller animals and potentially on humans. In ecosystems under stress, the boundaries between scavenging, competition, and predation blur. Neanderthals, already operating near their physiological and ecological limits, faced a landscape that was becoming more hostile rather than more forgiving. There is also evidence that carcass availability declined. Natural deaths of megafauna, which could once be exploited opportunistically, became less common. This removed an important safety net, high-reward food sources that did not require dangerous close-range hunting. Without these opportunities, Neanderthals were forced to take greater risks more often, precisely as conditions became less stable. Crucially, Neanderthals did not fully compensate by expanding into smaller or more diverse food sources. Their technological and cultural systems were optimized for large prey, not rapid dietary diversification. While they were capable of innovation, the pace of environmental change may have outstripped the speed at which such shifts could be widely adopted across small, dispersed populations. The result was a tightening spiral. Reduced prey led to reduced population density. Smaller populations meant fewer hunters, less knowledge exchange, and diminished resilience to local disasters. Injuries that might once have been survivable became fatal when groups were too small to support the wounded. Seasonal failures accumulated rather than being absorbed. Importantly, this process did not unfold uniformly. Some Neanderthal groups persisted longer in refugial areas where prey remained relatively abundant. Others disappeared earlier as their environments deteriorated. This patchwork decline reinforces the idea that Neanderthals were not suddenly outcompete or overwhelmed. They were gradually squeezed by a changing animal world that no longer matched their specialization. In the final segment, we'll draw these threads together, looking at Neanderthals not as doomed hunters, but as remarkably successful Ice Age specialists whose deep relationship with animals sustained them for immense spans of time and ultimately defined the limits of their survival. When viewed across their entire history, Neanderthals emerge not as failed humans or primitive precursors, but as highly successful Ice Age specialists. For hundreds of thousands of years, they occupied some of the most demanding environments on Earth, surviving repeated climate swings, intense predation pressure, and direct competition with some of the most formidable animals ever to walk the planet. Their relationship with animals, both as hunters and as potential prey, was the central axis of that success. Neanderthals built their lives around large herbivores because those animals made survival possible in cold, resource-limited environments. Big game provided dense calories, fat, hides, bones, sinew, and fuel, everything required to endure long winters and short growing seasons. Their hunting strategies, anatomy, and social systems evolved together, reinforcing a way of life that was tightly integrated with the movements and behavior of Ice Age megafauna. At the same time, Neanderthals lived with constant danger. Cave lions, hyenas, wolves, and bears were not abstract threats, but everyday realities. The injuries preserved in Neanderthal skeletons speak of repeated close encounters with powerful animals, both hunted and encountered unexpectedly. Survival depended on cooperation, awareness, and restraint as much as strength. Fire, shelter choice, and group cohesion were not cultural luxuries, they were anti-predator technologies. What ultimately constrained Neanderthals was not a lack of intelligence or skill, but the narrowness of their ecological niche. Their deep specialization made them extraordinarily effective hunters under stable conditions, but less adaptable when those conditions began to unravel. As large herbivores declined and landscapes fragmented, the foundation of their subsistence strategy eroded. Each lost animal population represented not just fewer meals, but a loss of materials, energy security, and cultural continuity. In contrast, other humans entering the same environments relied on broader diets and different risk strategies. This difference did not instantly erase Neanderthals, but it steadily reduced their margins for survival. Over time, small disadvantages compounded. Populations thinned, knowledge networks shrank, and recovery from bad seasons became harder. Seen through the lens of hunting and predation, Neanderthal extinction appears less like a dramatic failure and more like a closing chapter shaped by environmental mismatch. They were hunters perfectly adapted to a world of giants, a world that slowly disappeared beneath them. Their story reminds us that survival is not just about strength or intelligence, but about fit. Neanderthals fit their animal world with remarkable precision for immense spans of time. And in doing so, they left behind a record not of weakness, but of one of the most demanding and intimate relationships between humans and animals ever known.